Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is still wrapped in a pandemic. Here we are. Uh, this hour I'm going to show now occurred in March of 2020 as we were settling into the pandemic. Um, it's a conversation with Herman Daly, one of the pioneering visionaries behind the idea that economies really do have to fit inside the thing called the environment. And even more important to me, he also had a very ethical lens on his approach to economics, saying that well-being, welfare, the welfare of nature, the welfare of human societies was not being adequately factored into how we measure economic progress. Um, so we're going to have a conversation in about 1 hour from now at 12 o'clock U.S. Eastern Time with a group of scholars, colleagues of Herman Daly from his decades of work, and those carrying forward his ideas into the future. I'm going to start here back. This was mid-March of 2020, and I had just asked Herman at his retirement home what the pandemic was doing for him. He says some important things related to polio, which he experienced, and of course, we went on from there. So we're going to start here. I'll put a little note on the screen for those who are coming in late so they know what they're looking at. Here's Herman Daly. And in the comments, let me know if you hear it adequately. It would be really useful to have a conversation with two people thinking deeply, in one case for half a century, about how we can do a little better than we have been. There's a brittleness to our structures that's really been revealed in a profound way right now. And there are comments that are going to come in. I'm going to post some of those in a second. We're streaming live on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter via Periscope, and this will all be archived so people can watch later. Herman, I'd love to start with you and just get your sense, first of all, for each of you, I'll ask you, where in the world are you? And just give a quick sense of how this epidemic has shaped conditions for you right now. So Herman, maybe give a hello from Virginia and let us know how you're doing there.
Okay. Well, I'm in Midlothian, Virginia, in a retirement home. My wife and I have lived here now for 4 years. So we're not able to get out, of course, like everyone else in Virginia and Maryland. We're sort of on a stay-at-home order, except for very highly necessary trips. And we go to the pharmacy, maybe, and to the grocery store, but even that is rather limited. So that's about where we are. So it's a good time to think and sit around and talk to people.
And what's been that, like, what's the top line thing when you wake up in the morning after figuring out breakfast and what aspect of this resonates most powerfully with the way you've been thinking about the world?
Well, I suppose, I think of economics as a life science, and basically the economy is a subsystem of the ecosphere. And largely in ecological economics, we've been trying to make that fit better and to recognize all of the life support systems that we receive from the biosphere and to not damage them. Now we have to think a little bit more about the disservices that we receive from the larger ecosystem and how to protect ourselves against them. These random changes in something as insignificant as a virus in China or anywhere else roils the stock market and brings a shutdown to life. So that's rather an enormous change in the interdependence in the world, which, well, I think we've not paid sufficient attention to.
Yeah, I'm going to broaden the picture here, and that issue. I was looking back. We rewatched the film Contagion, which had a lot of expert support and how it was written, and rereading some of the predictive literature about pandemic impacts and the complete shutdown that's required here to stall the virus so long enough to control it eventually didn't seem to be adequately foreseen. maybe you and Kate could talk a little bit about that. Is the profoundness of how this has shocked the system? Does it feel unsurprising to you, or did it take you by surprise too?
Well, I'll just mention one. I think we've sort of set ourselves up for such a thing with globalization and the long supply lines coupled with just-in-time inventories and just-in-time research, just-in-time learning. Everything is stretched thin to maximize current profits. And then globalization. We have interdependence through so-called free trade, free capital mobility, increasingly free migration or uncontrolled. And so all of this seems to me to be something that viruses will just say, well, thank you very much. You've made it easy for us. And I think we have inadvertently.
Yeah. And then there's this human trait that you've seen kick in almost all the way along the chain from China in the very earliest days. Local officials were not eager to share bad news up the chain, and that you see there's been a lot of reporting at every stage. There's been some issues where the human element impeded rapid transmission of the knowledge that could have been made this a little better. And of course, here in the United States, it's been a bit of a nightmare with disinformation, misinformation. What someone today was calling on NPR an infodemic, paralleling the pandemic. So Kate in England, there's been everything from Boris Johnson testing positive to whatever your local situation is. Could you give just a quick snapshot of how what your community and your family are, how you're dealing with this, and then you can weigh in a little bit on this concept of how it relates to economic thinking.
Yeah, sure. So I live in Oxford. I moved here in 2001 to work for Oxfam. It became my home. I'm still here. I have 11-year-old twins. So the biggest immediate shift in my life is I can't go and visit my parents anymore who live in London. And I'm homeschooling. My partner and I are both here, of course, and we are homeschooling our children. So, and my work life is as busy, more busy than ever, desperately working to set up digital platforms so that collaborators around the world can work with us on putting the tools of donut economics into action. So we're working incredibly hard because of this context, and I'm pulled away every day for several hours to go and homeschool my kids. I live in a street in Oxford that never actually had a community. I didn't really know beyond one or two doors either way who was there. And I've always felt really bereft about that, actually. And now we have a WhatsApp group, and there is phenomenal community. You're talking about the human traits. I mean, as well as the disinformation and the delay, there is the phenomenal jumping into action and the joy in rediscovering local community people, helping each other, looking out for each other, making jokes. And that for me has been a very positive side. But the combination of working harder than I've ever worked, homeschooling my kids, and being part of the community, it reminds me of actually gender theory that I learned when I was at Oxfam of what they called the triple burden of women's lives. And it's actually not women's lives, it's the caring life of the household, which is to do your work or earn an income, to care for the family and participate in the community. So I feel huge strictures on my time. When I wake up in the morning, I'm just into a timetable of moving between those three things. So that's what I'm immediately feeling here.
Yeah, this issue of trying to fit the strictures that are required here to get this under control into daily life is so profound. And I've just been reading and connecting, tweeting significantly about the unrealistic expectations in developing countries where there's been a lot of pushback from folks in India, for example, saying that social distancing is a privilege, that only those of us who have roofs and don't have to walk 100 meters to a well to get the water just to drink, let alone to wash our hands, are just immensely privileged. And when you think about Modi's effort to shut down India, 1.3 billion people, not to mention what's happening in Africa shortly, it's a profound sense of the world facing a multidimensional reality, which actually reflects economics in so many ways too. There's no one economics situation, and how do you square that with whether it's climate or these other global challenges is really hard. Kate,
That's a really nice point, because people talk about social distancing, but actually what it really is physical distancing.
Exactly.
Right? And so we desperately try to remain social, and people who are privileged to have technologies like the ones we have can do it like this. And as you're talking, many millions of people, billions of people do not have these. But the point you just made is really interesting, that if you have in your home running water and a cooking stove and entertainment like a TV, you can physical distance and still enjoy the necessities of life. But in many countries, people don't have that in their home. It's a public service, or it's in a public shared common space. So just as you said, you have to go to the well. I'd not thought of that point. I think that's a really great point, that in communities where actually there's a lot of commons and communally shared resources, collecting firewood, going to the well, even communal TV watching sometimes in the village square, all of that, because of physical distancing, a lot of the necessities can't be provisioned for. I think that's a really important point.
And it also says that we're in for a wave of disease that's really going to be a terrible. It reminds me, but it's actually even more extreme than the pieces I wrote back in 2007 on what we call the climate divide. You know, that the impacts of climate change on whether you're rich or poor are enormously different. And of course, the culpability question of, you know, who's emitting most of the greenhouse gases. And yesterday, actually, it was my son in Los Angeles who was saying, you know, here's a disease that was spread by the rich, meaning through transit and commerce, and is mostly going to impact the poor through these issues we just described. There's some comments coming in that are pretty good, and they help set up the next questions, I think. Baba G is saying this pandemic is the catalyst for the tectonic shifts that are coming. The shift isn't a result of the pandemic. And he also says tectonic shifts in personal transportation, energy production, delivery, driven by economics, not by a new love for the environment. And his question, how do economies deal with these shifts short-term, as uncertainty leads to the fear, discontentment, anger, and could very well lead to civil unrest promoted by certain governments as a way to challenge energies? Wow. That's a pretty big question. I think, let me just frame it slightly crisper, which is this a moment for an expanded opportunity to shape things in a new way? And Herman, I know we had the same discussion back in the Great Recession, or is this? Oh, sorry, I just want to get rid of that comment. Or are we still? Is this a blip in what's still a long journey to reframing of how we measure progress and the like?
Well, just thinking of it in more concrete terms here, we just had the Democratic primary elections that have been interrupted, but it seems to me that the ideas that were discussed in those debates, three of them have really come to prominence in view of the current situation. I mean, I think it's become clear that Bernie Sanders' idea of, or many people's idea of universal health care, single payer health care, that's, I think, harder to argue against now than it was before. Also, I think Andrew Yang in the universal basic income notion, it seems like we've enacted already, Congress in great haste, enacted a kind of a version of that, a temporary and reduced version of such a thing. And then Elizabeth Warren's emphasis on the wealth tax, I think that has gained a lot of prominence in view of the fact that we've just been discussing, the tremendous inequalities, inequities in our country, and the fact that the burdens are going to fall so much on the lower class, the working class. They've just been disemployed in mass, and we've basically, this is a question I raise for others to think about too. We seem to have put the brakes on the real economy in order to avoid contagion, to be physically isolated, stay at home. At the same time, we're opening the spigot for the monetary economy, to giving the Fed and the banks just, come on, put the money through. And why is that going to be inflationary? Well, I kind of think it will be. or at least I don't understand why it won't be. And that may give some further impetus to the idea of the wealth tax. Let's get some of that money out of the system through a wealth tax and redistribute to help finance what we're spending at the lower end. So those are things that I think might be consequences politically and economically in the short run in the United States of this. I'd be interested in what other people think about that. That's just off the top of my head.
Yeah, there was a conversation on Friday that a colleague did as part of a resilience journalism training we're just starting to do. Dale Willman had Nate Higgins from the Post-Carbon Institute on with others, Jon Erickson and Juliet Schor, and they all agreed in a way. They were saying this is an emergency moment where Nate put it pretty crisply, you have to do it all. You've got to get basic income to people, and you do have to stimulate, save businesses at the same time. Now, what strategy you use to do that one, and then he backed away and said the bigger challenge will then emerge later. But we're really in a complete. Juliet Schor said the economy. This isn't a recession. It's a stoppage. It's a very different kind of thing.
Yeah, very different. Very different. It's you just stopped producing for an independent reason to control the contagion. It wasn't a slowdown so that's very different.
Can I jump in there and say?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Kate.
This point that Herman's bringing up about the difference between the productive economy and what he was calling the monetary economy. So I can't resist playing with toys. Okay, so I've got this hose pipe that right now I'm going to say this symbolizes the circular flow of goods and services through the productive economy. So somebody sells coffee in a cafe. Of natural capital here from my fern. Nature goes into this pipe. Okay, this is not a self-sustaining pipe, so let's just recognize that the economy uses natural resources. But what I'm trying to distinguish here is the productive economy of people who depend on salaries, paying for each other's salaries every time they spend money. That's part of the economy. But I'm going to say there's a bit of payments that are coming out of it, and I'm going to use my little kitchen funnel here, that are going over here. These payments are being siphoned off. Where are they going? They're going for rent, they're going for mortgages, and they're going for debt. So it's the financial and the real estate sector who have the right to use money as credit that bears interest. It's the rentier landlord, it's the rentier economy that's extracting a rent permanently. And this crisis for me is highlighting the difference in people's source of income between those who depend upon this flow of income between salaries and incomes, and then those who are extracting a rent. And what the virus has done through physical distancing is shut this down. You cannot circulate. But what is happening here? Are these rents being stopped, or are they still being extracted? And the most striking and different measures that I hear of, we need interest-free loans, because that means we're beginning to break the presumption that rent can always be collected, that extraction has the first right on capital. And that, to me, is one of the most valuable insights that we're getting now, because we can suddenly see the difference between the productive economy and the extractive economy. And let's see it and learn from it and change it.
So that's the question, Kate, though. I want to ask you a little more to dig in. Is there anything about this moment yet, or what you might anticipate, that gives you confidence that we can avoid over focusing on that, what Nate Higgins was describing, meaning getting things going, which we know is essentially sustaining the existing pathways and norms, and getting someone to really pay attention to how to reframe this? I just saw last week, I think OECD was blogging that this is going to make the Marshall Plan look small, you know, that globally in terms of how much money is going to flow. And when I write about climate adaptation, for example, there's always this tendency to invest climate adaptation finance in the things we already know, like building storm barriers, whether or not they're logical or correct. So what's your sense of what it would take to actually have who is it who needs to know, and what can change their full stop new thing possibility?
So, as people always say, never let a good crisis go to waste. But there's always at least two camps with that in mind, right? And there's business as usual, which when it gets collapsed by a crisis, wants to resurrect itself and actually build back stronger, more powerful, and more advantageous. And Naomi Klein did a brilliant job of documenting that in the shock doctrine. And then there's the other team, which is saying, hang on, we have a vision of a completely different future that we already know we want. And we can't let this crisis go to waste. And many people say that the financial crisis was not capitalized upon because the ideas weren't ready, right? And they weren't brought together. Have we done our homework since 2008? Have we started assembling those ideas so that they are ready? And I would say, actually, I think what part of what's going to determine which way that goes is the big framing ideas, the paradigms that we steer ourselves by, the metaphors we hold in our minds, the pictures we draw for ourselves. And that's why, to be honest, it's a huge privilege for me to be in this conversation with Herman. We've never met before, but his work has influenced my thinking for decades. And I trained as an economist back in the 1990s. And it's only thanks to, and I walked away from it because I thought this mindset is so limited. I'm deeply frustrated. How can we call the death of the living world an externality? That is absurd. And it was only when I picked up this book, Beyond Growth by Herman in the early 2000s. I read it while I was actually doing jury service. So I was going in and out of a court case. And while sitting in between that, my brain was turning circles because it had in it concepts and diagrams that I had never been taught. And that set me on the path saying, right, I actually want to be an economist now because I want to help make this economy happen. And you don't just get to make it happen. You have to find moments, cracks or great fissures in the system like this one, when we can bring these ideas, which actually have been around for decades, and bring back those images. So I would love to share some of the images, the one that Herman drew, that I think so powerfully helps us reframe the paradigm. And I'll let Herman speak to this, but this diagram, once I'd seen it, there's no going back from this image. Once you see it and you get it, and economics can't just put it back in the box.
Can you talk it through a little bit, Herman?
Sure. Maybe there's some children watching this program since they're all out of school, and I'll talk to them about this. You know, you probably remember in school they used to give you little puzzle books, and one of the puzzles was always a picture, and the question would be, what's wrong with this picture? And the picture usually would be pretty reasonable. Everything looked pretty right, but there was something wrong, and you had to sit there and think and figure out what was wrong with the picture. Well, I've been using this picture as a way of emphasizing the another picture, the faults of another picture, which was the basic circular flow diagram on the first pages of every textbook, where this, you just go around and around, and there's no inputs from nature and no outputs of waste back to nature and so forth. So this was an idea to look at the economy in its physical dimensions, respecting the first and second laws of thermodynamics and not contradicting them and not making it look like a perpetual motion machine. Well, I've used that to make that point over and over. I mean, that diagram is probably 40 years old, and I use it for 20 years teaching. And then one day in class, I guess I was feeling especially unusually self-critical. And so I asked the class, what's wrong with this picture? And so we puzzled over it for a while, and it became, after a while, I won't go into all the false leads, but if you look at just that empty world diagram, what is the final product of the economic system in that picture? What is the end product of everything? Well, it's waste matter and waste energy. And that's it.
Right.
So the economy is an idiotic system for taking useful matter and energy and grinding it up and converting it into waste matter and energy. That's the physical picture of the economy. So to make sense out of it, you really have to escape from just physical dimensions. And so what was wrong with the picture is that it stayed within the physical world. It did not go into a world of experience or sentience or welfare or enjoyment of life. So the whole purpose of grinding up all of those useful things into waste is that we have to do that to enjoy life. We are what the physicists call dissipative systems, and all of our wealth is a dissipative system. So we have to compensate for this dissipation, and that's the physical part. But so how did we correct this picture? The correction I'd like to make to this picture, which actually we've already made it, Josh Farley and I in our textbook, made it, is to draw on the outside of the circle to put welfare. And then we have two sources of welfare, one directly from the economy, an arrow from the economy to welfare outside the circle. And and then another arrow from the ecosystem, the natural capital, directly to welfare. So we get welfare directly from natural capital. We get directly from economic man-made capital. Well, as the economy grows, then the arrow representing economic services contributing to welfare, that gets bigger and bigger, and the arrow representing the direct ecosystem services to welfare gets smaller and smaller because the economy crowds out the ecosystem. So that's what really gives an economic dimension to this picture, is that you have two sources of welfare, the ecosystem services and pure economic services. What we're interested in as economists is the sum of the two. It's the total welfare. So we want that size of the economy such that the sum of the services from the economy plus the services from the ecosystem is a maximum, and that's what gives an economic dimension. So we can go on from there, on and on and on.
Yeah.
But so Herman is being wonderfully self-critical and pointing out what's missing from his diagram. But let me say that myself, as somebody who graduated, flip back to Herman's diagram.
Yeah.
Somebody who had graduated from economics, and then I did a master's in development economics. But this was absolute seismic mind-shifting stuff, because in mainstream economics, they say, welcome to economics. Literally means the art of managing the household. And on day one, you learn supply and demand. You'll just dive straight into the market. And it's not bounded by anything but what we call externalities. And when you start here, he's drawn the economy as a subset of the living world. And that changes everything. And Herman has a wonderful story about trying to convince the World Bank in their 1992 report to draw the box of the economy inside a circle. And it disturbed them so much they eventually just took the diagram out, because it was such a radical shift. I mean, this is the most radical move you can make in economics, to put the economy within a living system and treat it as a bounded system. But
that was I'm glad to hear that. That was my thought. That's what happened to me. And I'm glad it happens to other people too.
Oh my goodness!
It did not happen to the World Bank, because we went over and over, and I tried and tried to get, and I was simply told that's not the right way to look at it. That's not the right way to look at it. And if you look at it that way, it threatens the World Bank and many economists, including me earlier, with a question which you can't deal with. If this is the true picture, then the economy is constrained by a larger system. It cannot grow beyond the boundaries of the larger system. Mm-hmm. You can develop qualitatively, you can improve, you can have better morals, you can have better technology, but you can't keep growing. And that was what the World Bank still is devoted to. And so for that reason, it just could not be a part of the World Development Report. It had to be dropped.
And that's where you know you're changing paradigms. When people are so threatened by a mere circle, that's when you know you're onto paradigm shift. And if I can say the second thing for me that is so shifting and profound about this is that beautiful contrast between empty world and full world. And Herman's always very generous, saying, well, in empty world, maybe it was okay. Maybe it's okay to just sort of not take so much notice of the living world, because it always seemed to be so expansive. There was always so much more atmosphere, so much more land. And that sort of generosity of spirit to the founding fathers, that maybe they, maybe they could ignore it. Although, of course, through colonialism and reliance on the unpaid care economy, they couldn't. But then come to full world and say, how would you know when that square of the economy was banging into the edges of the, how would you know? And how would you be able to describe that circle of ecosystem? I mean, when I first saw this, it's a concept. It's the carrying capacity. The ecosystem is drawn as a circle. And the seismic moment, again, for me, came in 2010. I had just come back from maternity leave. I was sitting at my desk in Oxfam, and somebody was running by me all the big ideas that had happened in the previous year. And if you flip to the next slide, Andy, it was the planetary boundaries diagram. The Earth system scientists at Stockholm Resilience Centre and all over the world who'd come up with 9 planetary boundaries. There's 9 life-supporting systems within which humanity must live. And they had quantified it. And they said on climate change, it's 350 parts per million. And so that's the outside the donut. And when I saw that, it was like, that is the quantification of Herman Daly's circle. We are now moving somewhere. We've got metrics. We don't have to do everything in the metric of money. We've got alternatives. And I felt like this was the most massive challenge to the mainstream of economics, that everything had to be quantified in monetary terms. Actually, here we can do it in natural metrics. And I added the inner boundaries. If there are outer boundaries of pressure on the planet, there are inner boundaries on the pressure of individual lives. And my goodness, we feel that now. So for me, this was the most crucial diagram that helped me start moving in this direction and draw the donut, and really give a sort of keep alive the ecological economics in its evolving new diagrams that help people see things in new ways. So thank you.
I think that's a real step forward, because it disaggregates the big picture into a lot of pieces and gives the physical dimensions to them. And as you say, it adds that inner boundary too, which was absent from the original picture. A little bit taken up with introducing welfare, but still, this is much more disaggregated and specific. So that's a nice, really step forward.
And if we jump in this picture just briefly to use it, I mean, the idea of it is it's about meeting the needs of all people within the means of the planet. Leave nobody falling short in the hole in the middle, but don't overshoot planetary boundaries. We can start to tell the story of what we're experiencing in this pandemic now. It starts with the pressure of human systems, that expansionist, growth-based human economy. We're continually pushing into nature spaces, and we get these zoonotic diseases like Zika, like SARS, like Ebola, like coronavirus. So biodiversity loss. And as Herman said, there are disservices that happen when we push too much and create such a threat to the wild spaces. We get a massive hit on human health. And that immediately now in this crisis has had a hit on incomes and work, and on social networks, on people's ability to meet of communities. Suddenly people who live in high income countries, rich cities like this one in Oxford, you go in the supermarket, there's no food on some of the shelves. People who never imagined that they would not be able to buy food in the shops are suddenly experiencing what people experience in low-income countries every day. So there's something very equalizing about realizing that we're all vulnerable to the knock-on effects of pandemics.
Right. There is, I want to show this from Twitter. Bill Bow, and actually there's a lot of comments have come in that I'd like to try to scroll through in a minute. But one thing that Bill has said here, in looking at the great flatten the curve graphs that have gone around, some of which actually date back to the 1918 epidemic. There was actually this understanding was emerged then. What you see there that it's a little harder to capture in the more this dimensional graph is to the temporal element. You know, we're in a surge, and there's a shape to human activity right now. This sort of a conversation I had last week with Deborah Brosnan, who's a disaster risk expert, was that resilience is an activity. It's a process. It has a time dimension to it. So the question here was, is this graph of healthcare system capacity, might this help raise awareness that ecological ceilings and social foundations apply across the board? It was kind of interesting to see that come up. I don't know if you could both quickly weigh in on having that dimensionality to it as well.
I'll jump in and say the obvious, and then Herman can elaborate on it. Herman created the three conditions for sustainability many decades ago. One, extract Earth's renewable resources no faster than Earth can regenerate them. Two, dump pollutions and wastes in Earth's sinks no faster than Earth can assimilate them or make them harmless. And three, use non-renewable resources no faster than we can find substitutes. And what I see here is an absolute equivalent. For allow infection and pandemic to, or allow a virus to spread no faster than humanity has created the capacity to deal with it. So what this curve does, it doesn't say, oh, we'll make sure nobody gets the virus.
Right.
Most people are going to get this virus, but manage it within the carrying capacity. And of course, we can't change Earth's carrying capacity. We can reduce it, but we can't increase nature's generosity. We can increase the capacity of our health systems, and many countries have systematically underinvested in them for decades, and so that capacity is much lower than it could be. And maybe that's one of the big changes that's going to happen. But I'll love to hear what Herman sees on that.
Yeah, I guess my thinking, you triggered it earlier when you talked about India and the Modi's rule that everyone goes back to their village. And then I saw on the news all these people crowding into buses and trains and trying to get back and not having a place to stay. And so it economics is the first rule of economics is count the cost. The costs in India, is the lockdown thing now. You've got this devastating threat of a widespread pandemic in India, and then the cure, partial cure that we seem to see is the lockdown, isolate. But then that practically destroys the low level of livelihood of people who are barely getting by already. And so I'm really puzzled with this fundamental question of counting the costs in this situation, and at what point do you say, well, it's we'll just have to let the virus go for a while because we have to stay alive by working. And at what point do you say, well, no, the virus is so deadly, we're just going to have to risk upsetting everybody's life and starvation. So that's just an expression of personal angst, I guess, or professional incapacity to give a good answer.
Yeah, I tell you, I've been talking to a lot of people in India, in the Himalayas, elsewhere, by electronically. And I don't think there is an easy answer at the moment, except to understand that in the long run, systems have to be shaped in ways that boost capacity on the ground for resilience. And that means basic provisions, basic capacity to endure a hazard. There's so much that I've learned. Sorry, Herman.
I was just going to say part of resilience here seems to be immunity, developing immunity in this concept of herd immunity and how soon that could be developed, and whether that's that's reasonable as a statistical statement of probabilities that happens during a pandemic. Whether it translates into a policy is a big moral question.
Well, then it's interesting because that was my next question for both of you, is from models to policy. I've been talking to more than a few people about this very thing the last week or two on this new program. I launched this video series as a way to ask a lot of people to dig in on, well, how do we have actionable pathways? And I've had two different people who were former members of the National Security Council here on the show. And one thing that I'm going to do another program on came up when Rod Schoonover, who was a National Intelligence Council analyst, environmental scientist, he said, we had this all in the threat analyses for 4 or 5 years from the intelligence community in the United States said pandemic. But as he put it, it was on page 21. And, and it gets at this issue of all these competing priorities, energy security, climate. And and as a journalist, I said on that webcast, even as a journalist, I kind of write about these things, and it's almost like I've inoculated myself. I've written about pandemic, I've written about mega earthquakes, I've written about these things. But then what are the action points that can really make that resilience argument embed in development plans and investments and education? What does that look like?
I'll jump in. So resilience is coming up a lot, and it's a word that's we're going to use a lot more. And I think it's really important to think about different kinds of resilience. So I'm going to just distinguish between 2 kinds. And the one I would call it, sounds like deal with it resilience. Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, about a month ago, he said, well, perhaps as a nation, we'll just sort of let it, a wave of the virus go through the country and we'll sort of take it on the chin, he said. That is the kind of archetype, just deal with it. And that puts the onus of resilience on the individual or in the household. And by the way, we can't cope with it. And by the way, it turns out the national health system definitely can't cope with it. But what that accepts is we live in a world that's prone to shocks. There are going to be global financial crises, climate crises, health crises. And so just take it on the chin and deal with it. And that pushes the resilience to the level of individuals. And in a world of extraordinary inequality, millions of people suffer appallingly as a result. There is a very different kind of resilience, which I would say, let's call it design for it resilience. And we're not talking about the individual having the responsibility to be resilient in the face of inevitable shock. It's about saying, why are we prone to so many shocks? And I really want to pull back and take a global view, because we have this expansionist human project of endless economic growth, which means that the normal process, and indeed the assumed success of an economy, is expanding endlessly. And when we do that, what a surprise, we end up with financial crisis, we end up with a climate crisis, we end up with this health crisis. They have common roots at a deep paradigm of expansionism. So I think and also deep global connectedness. I think we've just been through peak connection. In July last year, there were 230,000 flights that took off on one day.
Wow.
I think we need a resilient system. And that means we need to look at our economic system as a whole, shrink that square in Herman's circle, come back within planetary boundaries. So first of all, let's not kick off all these ecological shocks, but let's make far more resilient human systems. Let's be regenerative, but have far more distributive economies that don't siphon off wealth into the hands of a 1%, but share wealth far more equitably, so that communities, when they are faced with shocks, have a more local resilience to turn to. So I want to make sure we don't go for deal with it resilience. We build design for it resilience. And that's a much bigger global question.
Totally. Yes. By the way, I don't know if you can see, I've tried to rejigger my screen. So there's so many good comments that came in. Can you guys see what's on the left side there? They're
too small to read.
Yeah, I'll try to read off a few of them because there are too many for everyone to answer. Let me just go up here. There were a couple of here. Oh, here's Salim Ali, he was on this program a few days ago. The main disagreement is that conventional economics assumes good feedback between economic and ecological systems, focuses on measurability, and using economic system as a proxy for ecological systems. Ecological economics challenges the efficiency of the feedback loops. I guess that one thing that's interesting there is that idea of, do we have to pull back a little bit from measurement? Does that, I could explain a little more of what I mean. Are we too, are we thinking too, seeking too much clarity or too much quantifiability?
Yeah. I think there's a problem in economics. I'm all in favor of empiricism, but some things are sort of clear, as someone, if you jump out of an airplane what you really need is a parachute, not an altimeter. Nice to crack your fall, but yeah, I think
Right.
first principles are sufficient to know the basic direction in which we have to move. And I get impatient sometimes with the oh well, is it optimal? How do we measure it, and so forth? After a while, you just accept that gravity exists, and you don't measure the fall of every apple. You just take it and go from there. I think we're at that point. I think we know enough to constrain growth. And I can't resist the opportunity to ask Kate Raworth the question. I mean, I sort of represent the past. She represents the future. And I've been hoping that more people would, have the same kinds of reactions that she has had. So, I'm a little, since I'm retired now, I'm not teaching and I don't have as much contact. But are there colleagues your generation who are thinking like you and have had similar epiphanies, you might say, that you have had, and who have had the courage to go with it? I mean, I would like to have been a fly on the wall in your tutorials with Wilfred Beckerman. So it took a certain independence of mind and spirit to do what you had done. How many people do you see in among your classmates that are doing that?
Oh, Wilfred Beckerman. So Wilfred Beckerman wrote a book in 1973 called In Defense of Economic Growth. It was a response to the Limits to Growth report. And he was my tutor. He's also a very dear friend of mine, now 91.
He's a very nice man.
He's lovely. But I don't think he's ever quite forgiven me for disagreeing with him. You'll be glad to know, Herman, and that you have created the most important form of economics in decades, which is ecological economics. And there are millions of people around the world who, when they find it, they say, yes, this makes sense to me. I always thought there was something wrong with me because economics didn't make sense. Now I found this, I realized it wasn't me, it was the economics. So this makes sense to people. And it's had huge influence. And in all the rethinking economics movements, in all the movements being led by young people in universities, this is right up there. But it's not on the curriculum. So when you arrive at university, still today, and I've sat in classes in universities, welcome to economics. Here is the market. Let's learn how markets work. Then we can talk about the market state. And then let's talk about externalities. The thing that's missing is that the students are not even taught that this is a worldview. So you don't even have an awareness that there's another way of thinking. And that's why students in the Rethinking Economics movement are calling for pluralism. Respect our minds and teach us that there are a plurality of ways of understanding, and perhaps we'll choose the paradigm that makes the most sense to us. But I think that these ideas are having more and more traction, thank goodness, if nothing else, from these kinds of climate and ecological crises and health crises, that people say, where is a form of economics that actually has the capacity to hold this? They find it in these ideas.
Well, I'm going to show you. Let me just quickly show you. There's a question that came in that's pretty relevant. Harry Flint says, I'm studying an MSc ecological economics, hopefully next September, and was wondering if you have any suggestions or advice of institutions in the UK offering graduates the opportunity to work towards well-being economy. So anything come to mind?
So let me just say that, so fantastic that Harry's up to study ecological economics, and may many more students discover that is exactly actually the economics that equips them for the 21st century. The real challenge, and I teach on a master's in environmental change and management in Oxford, and I see students come through, and by the way, of course, they are paying loans for their degrees, so their education is financialized. Yeah. They come on our courses, they learn about regenerative economics, circular economy, ecological economics. They say, yes, this is what I want to do. And then when they leave university, they have to pay off their loans. And the places that are offering them jobs sufficiently well salaried to pay off their loans want old school economics, want business as usual. So they actually often leave in a really existentially challenged situation, which is why Harry's very smart on asking about this. I've just set up Donut Economic Action Lab exactly to be one of the many institutions we need. We need ecosystems of new economic thinking so that people like himself can actually graduate and use the ideas they've learned and be putting them into practice, because this is, let's come back to where we began. If there's going to be a crisis, which way are we going to emerge from this emergency? And we need to build up these new ideas and harness the young generation. Thank you for calling me the next generation, Herman. I'm 50. So I look at the young people coming through and say, it's them. Let's harness that new talent coming through and make sure they get to employ the skills they've learned rather than put them in the bag and work with old ideas, because that's the only place they can pay off their loans.
Yeah, that's true. And the question about, where he could study, I think you know more than I do, but I think Leeds has a program, and in Europe, in Spain, Barcelona has a big area. Here in this country, University of Vermont has a arrangement with York and with McGill University. They're a little triad up there, which has programs in ecological economics. So I think there are those possibilities, but just the way things have developed in standard economics departments. I remember when I started teaching many years ago, there was, you had courses in history of economic thought. You can hardly find a course in the history of economic thought anymore.
Yeah.
It used to be required. Now it's not even available as an elective. There used to be courses in comparative economic systems, capitalism, socialism, so forth. Well, now we all know that there's only one alternative. There's no alternative, and it's all the capitalist system.
Yeah. And
so
then sorry.
And so the space which was occupied by those, and then economic history has fallen out. They've just kicked that out too. Not rigorous enough. Go over to the history department. So all of those credit hours that used to be involved there, they've all gone into econometrics and higher theory and mathematical economics. So that's I think, a real tragedy within the teaching of economics. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with theory. I like theory, but that you can go overboard with it.
And I'll add a last one, that there was a real division between, well, this is macroeconomics and microeconomics, and then you can go and study development economics, as if it was a completely different kind of thing. And I think this virus, shocking systems, literally leaving people in many parts of the world uncertain where they're going to get their food from, their healthcare from, how they're going to provide their education. I think with the vulnerability of our global systems, I think it's going to help Western society, high-income countries, what they consider economics for their economies. It's going to open that up to the fragility, to the resilience conversations, to the pandemic network effect conversations that actually are completely normal in low-income countries that have had Ebola, have had devastating impacts from financial crisis and imposed debt crises. So they know that shocks happen. Yeah. We need to recognize that none of us are developed. I've never been to a country that has a right to call itself developed. We're all developing countries now because we need to come back within planetary boundaries, or meet people's needs, or do both of those at the same time.
You just reminded me of a post I did on .earth way back when the Millennium Development Goals were out, saying, one of my questions was, do the top billion need new goals too? Because when you look back at all the Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals, they're still mostly focused on the undeveloped, quote unquote, world. And that left a big chunk of the impacts on the planet unaddressed. There's a great question, a couple more great points here. Peter Duran says, where do externalities figure in the attention economy? Is attention a blind spot in donut economics, well-being economics? I mean, to me, that gets back to what I said about the fact that we have a new element of the Earth system, which is the information system. And we can see already it's very hackable. Our brains, as Sherry Turkle at MIT and others have shown very powerfully, are distracted and hijacked. Attention is hijacked. Tristan Harris's work recapturing your attention. Is that model more important than ever, given how decisions or indecision about pandemic behavior are driven by this big swirling mass of social media and the like?
Yeah, I guess the what do they call it? This surveillance economy and the business of information. That I think this becomes very important. Economists have dealt with this to some degree, but information is a non-rival good, and it doesn't fit well in the market. And we tried to make it fit in the market by artificially making it scarce and giving patent ownership to certain information and technologies. And I think this is, you see it right now with, well, now I'm dependent on things like Instacart for ordering food. And I just saw that Instacart, the employees went on strike, and I listened to what they were saying. And they had every reason to strike. I mean, they were really being ripped off by these people who have captured a node in the information economy such that they control everything through this bottleneck of information. And then they farm out on really drastic terms people to work for them to fit in, to supply the needs of others. So I think this is a real problem, and it's going to cause further difficulties. I don't know quite how to say it.
The attention economy makes me come back here, actually. People hang out on Facebook and think they're just there to enjoy posts of their friends' cats and neighbors and dogs and what we're doing. And actually, they're siphoning off something, which is your attention, and monetizing it through advertising. So again, there's always, when something's free, you're the product, and what is being siphoned off, and that's the attention. But the power, the impact and the way these technologies are used and the impact they have on us, of course, depend on what their purpose is. And that depends on how they're owned and how they're financed. So a platform like Facebook is owned and financed in a way that's there to maximize revenue, and that's to capture attention in order to monetize it. But there are other platforms using the very same kind of technology. In the Netherlands, there's a platform called Gebed Online. It means neighborhood online. It's a cooperatively owned platform. It's popping up neighborhood to neighborhood. It's financed and owned and governed by the communities who use it. So the point is to circulate useful, valuable information amongst those people. So it's not the platform itself. It's not the means of sharing information. It's how it's owned and governed and financed that determines what it does with our attention.
Exactly.
What was the name of that again?
Gebed Online. It's one of my few Dutch words. It's Gebed. Gebed, it looks like, and if you want to say it in English, online. And it's a wonderful platform that neighborhoods are using. And it's like community connection without the massive corporates. And it's just a lovely example that it's not inherent in the technology. It's how it's purposed, networked, governed, owned, and financed. And that makes it all the difference.
For sure. And even within Facebook, you do see useful community-driven discussion and discourse. My little tiny town here in the Hudson Valley has Phillipstown locals, and it is the place it is the town square. It is the place you go to see if you heard a loud noise or if the traffic is weird. But the bigger system seems very broken, meaning at the larger scale. It's kind of an enormous new challenge is how to get this system with the upside a little more dominant. I think it still is overall a positive part of our experience. And right now, with the physical distancing, I think some paradigms are being broken right now. I think the university model,
exactly,
just as you all said, the loans that young people have endured, the debt to go to a college and learn, and now seeing how many resources they can exploit online. I'm hoping universities don't see this as just a temporary patch. We're all in Zoom right now, or on StreamYard here, and now we'll just go back to the norms. I don't know if you feel like that system.
Yeah, well, my grandchildren now are all taking their university courses online, and it looks like that'll go on for at least a while. So that may change, as you say, the whole paradigm. It may just be a lot more efficient and a lot better.
And a lot more connected globally. In other words, I think a lot of us in the physically distanced, prosperous world really hadn't fully absorbed, certainly I hadn't fully absorbed until a few days ago, just how profoundly impossible this is in the poorest places in the world. I mean, I've known just on this broadcast last Sunday, a sheep farmer for rural Massachusetts said most of her friends are not on the information grid, and the phone is the vital way that they stay in touch. But when you look at the situation in India and Nepal, and then of course sub-Saharan Africa, our awareness of these gaps in our systems globally, our awareness of Amazon burning, and the feedback mechanisms globally are changing in ways that I think are mostly positive, even with Trumpian, and Russian and other efforts to use the system in harmful ways, or ways that you might not see as productive. I think we're poised for betterment to come to the foreground. There's so many more questions. Some of them are pretty granular. I noticed that Brian Fitzgerald there happily posted the links. You can see. So this all gets archived. People can come back and sift for the links. I'll use Twitter to add some more features like that, which is great. Someone said there's something here. Maybe this is another one, aka Nextdoor.
Well, I don't think Nextdoor is owned as a cooperative, so it may look like it has the same function, but I think it's crucial. As with any enterprise, you need to ask, how is this owned and how is it financed? And that will tell you ultimately what it really is trying to do.
I'm muted. Andy Revkin here. 39 years into my sustainability journalism quest, which has involved a lot of interactions with Herman Daly, starting when I was doing my .earth blog at the New York Times in the aughts, the 2000s. He was a wellspring of insights, of basic ideas, of profound ways to jog people out of their the way they think about the world. And he's passed away, sadly, on the 28th, which I believe was a week ago. And I thought it was a good time to bring together a batch of colleagues of his, former students, people whose work has built on his work. A wonderful collection of folks have come together on short notice to dive in on both the legacy of Herman Daly and next steps. Where do we go from here? It's been a long-standing, I've had a long-standing sense that, and don't take this in a disparaging way, that there's this chunk of the serious community in economics that has discounted this work. I think that's a really flawed thesis. Just because you can't measure something doesn't mean it's not important, and we'll get into that idea, particularly going forward in a second. Hold on one second, I just have to get rid of that. There we go. So I just showed for an hour this wonderful unbelievably inspiring discussion that I organized in the early days of the pandemic with Kate Raworth, who calls herself a renegade economist. I would say that Herman had that property as well, back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, when these ideas really were, again, there was this sort of rising idea of limits to growth and the like, but it's felt like it's had been constrained in how it spills into the policies and the actions that shape our world. Let me just go forward here. I'm going to introduce things before I bring on my crew with a video that caught my eye. I'm sure some of Jon Erickson, Kate, Juliet, Katie Kish, Rigo, Josh, Farley may have seen this before. I wrote about it on .earth when it came out a long time ago. You have your conventional measures of growth. There's one of a familiar chart. You can see that little blip way down there. It was the pandemic, which of course is still going. And then you have this impossible hamster.
From birth to puberty, a hamster doubles its weight each week. If it didn't stop when mature, as animals do, and continue to double, on its first birthday, we would be staring at a 9 billion-ton hamster. This hamster could eat all of the corn produced annually worldwide in a single day and still be hungry. There is a reason why, in nature, things grow in size only to a certain point. So why do most economists and politicians think that the economy can grow forever and ever and ever?
Impossible Hamster. I'm not actually sure who, maybe someone here knows who created that. So you're going to meet my guests now in a second. Hold on while I clear the screen. And thank you to everyone who's coming on. Whoops. Stop that. Okay. Let's get to the crew. Oh, I have to, here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And greetings. Oh, wait, hold on. I have to expand my screen. I don't want to miss Peter. So here we are, the first crew. There, I think a couple of people, others are going to come on. Again, thank you so much. You're part of a network. Some of it's informal, some of it's formal, connecting people around. It's had various iterations. Katie Kish, early career scholars have been connecting universities from McGill to the University of Vermont and elsewhere in this question of how do we build new models, how do we actualize them in the world. So let's just do a quick round of hellos. On my screen, I have Jon Erickson at the University of Vermont, who has a new book coming out, very relevant. Greetings, Kate Raworth in the UK, in Oxford, with a long track record right from her work at Oxfam through donut economics. There's that donut on the wall. If you were around for the first hour, you saw her great visual aids, including the pipes and things. Juliet Schor, Boston College, who I think right now is on the West Coast, doing a residency of some kind. We'll find out more about that. Rigo Melgar, a PhD candidate at the University of Vermont. I think, or you're not a postdoc yet, or are you? Okay, soon. And Josh Farley, who was a co-author of Daly, a longtime collaborator, also University of Vermont. The textbook that's out there, you were the co-author of. You wrote these testimonials. There's a word for them in German, which I don't want to mispronounce. And we'll get to your work too. And again, Peter Victor York, who has a book out now on Daly's work, a real sort of a thorough account. Thank you for being here, first of all. If you watched the 2020 video and had some really vivid ideas that grew out of it, or when you think about Herman's work, if there's a core distilled concept that hangs with you most, maybe we could start with a little bit of a reflection from each of you. Let's start with Jon, who has been on this webcast really early with my colleague Dale Willman on can we grow new models out of the pandemic, basically. So Jon, what comes to mind? What are the word pictures? What are the visual or other themes that stick in your mind when you think about Herman?
Boxes and circles. Herman spent a career of drawing a box inside a circle and asking economists to have a reality check, right? That the economy, I think how he put it, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. So I stumbled upon this in a free book pile while I was in grad school at Rigo's stage at Cornell, and came across his book, Economics, Ecology, and Ethics. And I was taking a class that semester, one in economy, one in ecology, and one in ethics. And I was so confused. I was like, how could these three classes at Cornell University be talking about the same world? And just by chance, I stumbled upon this collection of essays, and it changed my world, changed my life. And I stumbled into my advisor's office and declared myself an ecological economist, and haven't looked back ever since.
Wow. I bet that resonates around the the squares here. Kate, I made a note during was I was rewatching our conversation from 2020 where you said people think of development economics as a separate thing. All just as John was just saying, there seems to be this compartmentalization that just really is harmful. So Kate, here we are 2.5 years after that first conversation. You've been on since with your husband, Roman, talking about how we gauge the future. How are things going? Back then, part of the question was, is there something about the shock that the world received at that time that could get us back into really digging in on, do we need to reshape how we measure progress? How are things going? And what are your vivid Hermanisms?
Well, it's lovely to be here now. You're talking about us here on the screen. As we all popped up, actually, I suddenly thought it's the Brady Bunch. So just today, can we be the Daly Bunch in this little,
I like that.
In these little boxes? Yeah. I was really moved actually when I came in here 10 minutes early, and there's you and there's me sitting kind of exactly here, and there was Herman, and I was almost confused, like, wait, is this live? No, this can't be live because there's Herman. And it was, yeah, and also listening to us reflecting so intensely from in the midst of lockdowns and that reality. And the one thing I'll say about that is it's certainly here in the UK, that everything could be changing here suddenly. No, it hasn't. The sense of maybe we're entering a new kind of economy here because of the realities and the new social practices that we are experiencing. That's gone, certainly here. By the way, just to answer about the impossible hamster, I am 99.9% sure that was the voice of Andrew Sims. And that was the team at the New Economics Foundation who made that fantastic video. So the one big idea I want to bring, and the idea, I'm just so like John, that struck me, boxes and circles. And not only is the power of Herman's boxes and circles, but the power of that showing us that how we can change paradigms can be so simple and so visual, and you do not need equations and you do not need clever words. And so I've decided to turn it into a bit of performance art. I'm going to do it right here, right? This was Herman's big thing. Every time you see a picture of an economy, and if you're lucky, they've labeled even inputs and outputs, you take your pen, ladies and gentlemen, and you draw around it a circle. And by the way, don't make it too far away, because we don't live in empty world. We're in full world. So that circle's close. By the way, this is way too generous, because actually what we already know is that it's way over the limits, right? So when I first saw this diagram Herman did, and of course this is the environment, had to label it. He wouldn't forgive me if I didn't label it. That would be like the World Bank cop-out, just making it look like a box. This, to me, this is the most radical act in economics, and it should be the beginning of every single textbook. And every single student should know of the possibility of this radical act. And in every lecture, they should have the courage and the confidence and the outrage, actually, to raise their hand and say, and why, Professor, are you teaching us a model that is not embedded in the living world and therefore does not recognize its dependence upon and constraints of that living world? How can it be 2022 and you still haven't got this? The onus is on you to explain, not on me to say why I like ecological economics. The onus is on you to explain why you're still doing economics not on a planet. I have to say, since hearing of Herman's death last week and putting out a tweet, I've been teaching this past week, I've actually been really angry about it, because I cannot believe this is still news. And when I show it to students, they're like, wow, this is amazing. No, this isn't what we're being taught in Macro 101. You think, what? How can it still be? So I know we're going to come back to that later, but the last thing I'll say, this diagram, phenomenal. And it was conceptual, and that matters everything. But of course, we need to be able to quantify it. And so when this beauty came along in 2009, that is, of course, the quantification, right? This is the planetary boundary scientist saying, thank you, Herman, for your circle. Here it is. And now we're going to show we're not just gently touching up against the edges of the boxes. We are massively overshooting it. And therefore, we must come back within the carrying capacity of the Earth. And to me, this changes everything. So a massive debt to Herman. It changed my utter worldview. I could simply say that it's that circle around the box that made me say, actually, I am willing to be an economist after all, because there's something at stake here. There's some work to do. So it brought me back towards economics.
That's great. Josh, as a collaborator of Herman for so long, what comes to mind? This has been it's tragic that he could have had many more years. Obviously, like I've had so many elders pass away recently who I cared about deeply. E.O. Wilson among them, and but you worked deeply with him. So how does that shape your thinking and doing?
So I actually, I was in the same PhD program as Jon Erickson with a very similar feelings about it. When I started the program, I thought it was based on really shaky scientific foundations, and that the ethical assumptions were even worse. And after my first semester, I was absolutely ready to quit. And I got a fellowship to go spend a year in Brazil, specifically not to study economics. But while I was down there, I was the rector of the University of Brasilia, told me about ecological economics. My folks had given me a book by Herman, and I read those, and it totally changed my worldview. I really wanted to be an ecological economist like Jon. Unfortunately, when I went back to my committee and told them I wanted to be an ecological economist, they said, if you want to graduate, you're going to write what we believe, not what you believe, which I think persists to this day. But he shaped my views on everything. So that, obviously the box in the circle was huge, and it shows that the economy can't continue to grow forever. And just like that hamster, in real life, systems grow until they reach maturity. And that's what has to happen with the economy as well. And Herman really defined that as the steady state economy, at which point, you grow until you can, the goal is to provide secure sufficiency for all without encroaching upon the planet's finite limits. And there was so much embedded in that. So it completely challenged this whole idea of mainstream economics growth forever. He introduced the idea of uneconomic growth, a super simple idea that the first units of consumption we dedicate to the most important things. And as we consume more and more, we, allocate those towards less and less important things until finally we just have too much stuff and it's just futile to keep growing. But at the same time, the ecological costs continue rising, and we reach a point at which the ecological costs of growth exceed the economic benefits, and it's idiotic to continue growth. So that's one big implication of that figure. We need to focus on development, on qualitative improvements over quantitative increase. But the other big point for Herman is that finite planet was not created by capitalists or, entrepreneurs or individual effort, and it belongs equally to everybody. And if we have to limit the size of the economy, then we really have to focus on who gets what, and distribution becomes first and foremost. And Herman was very open about the fact that you can't have, economics is goal-based. Goals are normative, what we decide we want. The idea of having, objective economic analysis is ridiculous. All social scientists I know are trying to change the system they're studying, which is just radically different than, mainstream scientists. And Herman was very explicit that is our goal. And so his moral foundations for the economy, I thought, were every bit as important as his understanding of the biophysical foundations. And basically he influenced, I would consider myself a Dalyist. He gave me my basic grounding in economics, and there's a million key themes that he introduced, the ideas of throughput, the ideas of, strong sustainability, that we can't substitute between built capital and natural capital. There's very few elements of my economic thought that weren't informed by him. Even like with Rigo, we're working on issues of money. And back when Herman was writing that money was loaned into existence by banks, that was completely contrary to mainstream theory. That's now accepted. And even the ideas of uneconomic growth are starting to, percolate up. So I could go on way too long-winded. There's other people I want to hear from, so I'm going to stop there. But
oh yeah, I think you've raised a really important point, which is along with his economic analysis and writing, his rhetoric, his way of using words and coming up with metaphors was incredibly powerful. To me, as a journalist, that mattered a lot. I think I'll show the clip in a few minutes when he talks about getting away from the idea everything has to be measured precisely when the basic parameters are clear. And to me, that's most important in thinking about the socioeconomic, the social, how you integrate the social components into how you think about growth is really hard to measure. Does that mean you don't do it? Does that mean you leave it out? No. This came up recently, just briefly, in the context of the new big American package, the Inflation Reduction Act, with $370 billion of spending for clean energy, et cetera. When you looked at the analysis, they do what's called optimization studies. And deep in the caveats, we don't factor in things we can't understand, like activism, including NIMBYism, people who don't want the wind turbine, and people who do. If you're not factoring in those key things, and you come out with a breezy projection for progress on emissions, which the analysis of the IRA did, then are you doing the public a service? Is that actually a picture of what's, and it gets distilled in the media to, oh, wow, we're going to cut emissions, way back below 2005 with this new package of spending. But we're not going to talk about all the social factors because we don't know how to measure them. So Juliet Schor, I first talked to you decades ago, a couple of decades ago. You won, I think, in 2008, a Herman Daly award for your work. Can you describe again briefly how he has shaped how you think, and what you're doing now and the like?
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I would also just start by saying that I agree with Jon and Kate and Josh about the limits and sort of the circles and the boxes, and that is really, when I think about Herman's impact, number one point, it's so profound, and of course one that mainstream economics has been absolutely blind to. I came to his work in a different way, which is that I grew up in a tradition which questioned mainstream economics from another point of view, which is more about its failure to see conflict, and class conflict in particular, but conflict of all types, and power. And so I was a quote unquote radical economist from an pretty early stage. And but in the 1970s, when I was being trained, radical economics also had an ecological dimension. I mean, we thought about impacts of capitalism, which we named it capitalism, impacts of capitalism on the planet. That was the 70s, of course, were a time when ecological, or what we called then environmental impacts, were pretty top of mind. And I had much less interaction with Herman than everyone else in the room, I would say. But his ideas were very profound for me. And in the mid 80s, I was part of a group of economists, again, lefty economists, who asked the question, what if there is an environmental constraint on growth? We were a group of macroeconomists working for the UN on a big project. How would we do macroeconomics differently? And it was a really interesting exercise. In the end, we failed. I think it was just too hard for us at that point. I mean, we had some good insights and so on and so forth, but the project of building a macro model with a growth constraint was just a step too far. When were we doing that? 1985 or something. So we, fast forward, we have those fantastic models. Of course, Victor and others have, Peter, Victor and others have worked on them. But I would say that for me, and I think for many of us, many of the basic insights that Herman developed and pioneered have been really central in our attempt to do economics differently. Maybe not always so successfully. I would say there's still too much siloing within economics, and and this is true in most of the social science disciplines. I would say the attempt, we have it in environmental sociology, and I think also in environmental politics, environment economics as well, and others, environmental psychology as it's called. Those subfields all started with the aim of transforming the whole discipline. And what's happened is that they have been too siloed. So there's like fabulous work that's been done in them, but we're not yet where we need to be. I do see things actually moving pretty rapidly now.
Where is that vanguard? Where are they moving rapidly? Like, what's an example of how this is pulling in? I know Kate's been working with at the city level with folks. So where are these glimpses of this sort of actualization?
I think economics is changing. I just did a 4-part series on the economics of climate change, and I did an analysis of the top econ journals and how much they covered climate change. And there is a top 5 economic journal, the QJE, that didn't ever have one article on climate change.
Wow.
But if you look at the last couple of years, suddenly there are many more people working on these issues, not necessarily in the ways that Herman would like, but at least it's sort of breaking through onto the agenda. How could it not be? And of course, now there's a lot more money flowing into the space. So that's going to change things too.
So we have Peter and Rigo to come. Rigo, I want to take us to the world of the next generation, and then we'll get to Peter with his biography. Let me just pull up. Here we go. So, Rigo, tell me a little bit about, like, what's the focus of your doctoral thesis? That's a good start for what keeps you up at night, and then what's with the network? I had Katie Kish very early on. Katie Kish from McGill was inspired by the conversation I had with Kate and with Herman to actually run a couple of these shows later, which was wonderful. And I learned a lot about this network. So who are you and how's that all going?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me here. I am
and there's Katie.
Stunned from having all these amazing people with me. I've been inspired by all of them, all the people who are in this show today. And well, I focus on the energy transition and understand the biophysical and social foundations and implications of that for the United States specifically, and for the financial sector, right? The role of the financial sector in driving the transition or not driving it, right? So that's kind of like my focus. And coming here, 4 years ago through the leadership of the Ecozoic, which Jon and Josh have been, carrying on to educate more the future, ecological economists between McGill University, the University of Vermont, and we are a growing network of young scholars from different backgrounds, but many really focus on ecological economics and trying to learn from Herman Daly. And I'm just gonna say, from the get-go, one of the things that really inspired me about him is that he focused so much on Latin America. I'm a Latin American originally, even though I've been living in the US for, 17 years, but he's from Texas. He had this connection with Mexico, and his work at the World Bank, what led him to the World Bank was this try to help improve development and try to make it more sustainable. And that's something that I really appreciate from him, and understanding that we gotta be focusing on actually achieving well-being through qualitative means as much as possible, instead of just continually growing the economy, which, by the way, all the countries, he will agree with me, all the countries of the world have 1%. The economic growth is basically transferring the wealth to the 1%. destroying the environment and maintaining this massive wealth inequality that doesn't really help people. So we're just doing growth for the sake of growth. For the sake is to, empower and reach the 1% everywhere. And that's kind of like what he came in to change. We have to rethink economics, and being also part of the Rethinking Economics movement. I know a lot of people from Rethinking Economics are watching today, and I just want them to be inspired by everyone on this show and from Herman Daly's legacy that really has transformed the way that we look at the economy. Understand the biophysical, ecological foundation drives the social interaction that we have, right? Because nature, ultimately, ecological economists care about three things: nature, justice, and time. And all that care comes from our ethic, right? And Herman Daly was driven by that ethic. A lot of it informed by his Methodist, background, which is really a background of caring about everyone.
Yeah. And Peter, Katie, I'm going to get to you in a second. I know you have a limited window because of childcare issues. It's great to see you again. It's been a while. I still think back to the shows you helped to organize. The one on the care economy really opened my eyes to a lot of what we're talking about here. And the one on terror management theory with the professor at Skidmore. So it's great to have you. But Peter, actually Rigo was just talking about Herman's experience and how that shaped his understanding and his impact. So you've done this book on him, and you're an economist and deeply dug in here too. So what drives you? What excites you at this moment? I won't say what's been lost, because I think you all reflect that there is a great loss here, but that there's a lot of power being carried forward. So just what made him who he is, and what's driving forward from there?
Well, it's a big question to try to answer.
Sorry.
That's okay. I just want to say I'm so appreciative that you've organized this group. I think I know everybody. I correspond with Rigo. I think we've actually met in person, but it's lovely to see everyone. I just want to say, though, by way of opening, my history is a little bit different from everybody else because I'm older than everybody else. In fact, I've completed my PhD, I think, just 3 years after Herman finished his. Mm-hmm. And I discovered his paper of Economics as a Life Science, which I highly recommend to everybody who's watching and listening. It's still very relevant. I discovered that when I was just completing my dissertation, just about to hand it in. So it made its way into my lit review and table of contents, but that's or references, but that's it. But one of the things that I found was that what Herman had talked about then, and he drew up a table, what we would call an expanded input-output table, was exactly the core of my dissertation, where I developed input-output analysis so it could include the flow of materials through the economy. So, and I follow Herman's work throughout. We met several times. He published or included one of my early papers in his 1979 book. So in other words, it's a different kind of relationship. It's sort of almost parallel careers, though. I wouldn't begin to compare the kind of impact that he had with anything I've done. But I just want to mention one event that really stands out for me. I invited him to York University. I'd left academia, gone back into it, and invited Herman to come to York at a time when there was a labor dispute. I didn't know that, of course, when I invited him. So I had to arrange for him to meet people and give his public lecture off-site. Unfortunately, Environment Canada had a regional office close by to the university. He gave a brilliant lecture. That was perhaps not too much of a surprise. He has a great command, or had a great command of the English language and a way of presenting his ideas. But what really impressed me was that I set him up in a seminar room in this building for 2 days, and I sat with him while he held court. I put the word out that Herman Daly was available to speak with anybody and everybody who came. And I was just so amazed at his breadth of knowledge, his patience, his gentlemanly-like behavior. Herman being a Texan, that means something. And I realized just what a first-class human being he is. So we need to bring that dimension in fully, because it wasn't just his ideas, it was his way of being in the world from which we can all learn. As to the biography, it was an idea that had begun nagging at me for some time, that somebody should write his biography. And I had a good couple of chats with Josh, I recall, and sounded out some people who I thought might be able to write a biography. But people I spoke to all thought it was a great idea, but they weren't able to take it up at the time. Well, I must have said this sort of thing around my household once too often, when my wife Maria said, Peter, he said, you write the damn biography, you do it. So I had not done anything like that before, but I thought, well, why not? I was retired and had the time, and I contacted Herman. He thought it was a good idea. Well, he agreed, as long as I also agreed that I developed most of the book to his ideas. So the book consists of 2 chapters about his life, and then how that influences ideas, which I'll come back to in a moment. But mostly it deals with very important topics that he addressed throughout his career. One of the highlights of my life was that I went down to Richmond, Virginia, and spent the best part of a week with Herman, interviewing him for the book. And we had, it was a wonderful time. I've got about 200,000 words of text on those interviews, and a lot of the book is based on that. So now, getting back to the specifics of your question, there are several things in Herman's background that really influenced, in my mind, his approach to economics. He was a polio sufferer, and when he was a teenager, had his left arm amputated, and I put to him the idea that this taught him a lesson about limits. It was a very difficult topic to discuss, of course, highly personal. Though we'd known each other for a long time, it wasn't a close relationship as it became later. And he said, yeah, that could be it, you know? So that was one factor. The second was his mother was a regular churchgoer and took him to church. And he enjoyed that, and it marked his life for years. His aunt was a Catholic, so he got the Catholic dimension of Christianity as well. And when I asked him, well, what church do you identify with? He said, well, I consider myself an all-purpose Christian, which I thought was a typical Herman response. And the third key influence was his time spent as a teenager working in his father's hardware store. And I think that taught him that the world had a physical reality to it, that you can't just assume things are going to happen. If you want water to flow down a pipe, you've got to know how to connect it and so on. So those were his early influences. I'll just mention one final thought that comes to mind. When he started university at Rice University, and he didn't want to have to choose between the humanities and the sciences. He enjoyed them both and was good at them both. And by certain circumstances, he ended up taking his first economics course as a history of economic thought course. That's what was offered. And he was under the impression that economics had one foot in the humanities and one foot in the sciences, only to discover, as in his words, that it did not have a foot in either of them. And that he spent his career, this is one way of seeing it, in trying to fix that problem with economics, bring back the relationship with the humanities, bring back the relevance of the sciences, and then we may be able to really grasp the predicament we find ourselves in with the economies of the world in the state they are and the environment that goes with it.
Well, bravo again. And let's hope that the input in the book it gets propagated further than the book itself. I could see a documentary being done on him too, if there hasn't already been one.
I'd go for that.
I could talk to some people about that. Again, there's lots to mine and think about. So I just want to get the input from the younger generation here again. Rigo, a couple of networkers, I believe, have joined us. Katie, as I said earlier, and David Baker. So, Katie, could you reflect a little bit on how things have gone? What's your facet of this prism, and what are you working on these days? And when you think about Herman, and this field and the gaps that still exist, what drives you forward?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. So hi, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here. Jon makes really great documentaries, so maybe there's something in the works there. I am currently the president of the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics. I work very closely with Peter on the ecological footprint now, which is my world in EE in academia, but of increasing importance to me is my role in my community center. I'm the vice president on our community center board, and my role as a mom to two wonderful little kids. And the reason that side of my life has become increasingly important is, in my PhD, I read a book that I think connected with so many people, and that's For the Common Good. And it really defines now my post-academic approach to ecological economics. And I think it exemplifies what ecological economics will be in the future, and what it's really turning into more and more. The book written, by Herman, it makes a lot of good points, and the one that really stands out to me is that economic theory, it has to move from being solely this academic discipline to thought that is in service of the community. And this means a lot to me now, and in the community center and with my kids, and even throughout my time as an academic, right? Like, I've been a member of the Canadian Society for a long time, because it's not just making those ties among us in academia. It wasn't just about making really good friends and having good colleagues, but it was about strengthening those ties so that we could make change together. And now seeing that community in action and the power that we have in terms of just the network that we've created, that's where a lot of the power comes from within academia. And so there needs to be some more focus on that. But then we see a lot of this focus from emerging scholars on communities in the world, and trying to answer that question of, how do we actually do economics differently? What does that look like on the ground? And, we can find a lot of examples of this, so that because we're trying to influence the system at a more disaggregated level, right? So Kate saying she's working with cities with the donut. A lot of emerging scholars are increasingly interested in questions that bring ecological economics into reconciliation. There's a group in Edmonton that's bringing ecological economics into the Girl Guide troops in that city. And that's such like an elegant way of using ecological economics, because it's young girls and they're learning to be citizens of the world, and they're developing this Girl Guide curriculum around ecological economics. And similarly with some Ontario eco schools wanting to have an elementary level curriculum, and me bringing it into the community center. This is great. This is how it's going to get out there. And I think that there needs to be more focus on that. And I think that there is more focus on that. There's a lot of room for prosperity without, the normal vision of growth in communities. And in my area, at least, ever since the pandemic, the volunteers, the number of people wanting to make change has really increased. The number of volunteer applications we get it's boomed. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity, and that's where I'm taking the lessons that I've learned from Daly into my life.
You raised a really important point that I've been thinking about a lot, which is this big shift from the top-down grand level area of action or inaction, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Sustainable Development Goals. The more I reported on the climate problem, through my 35 years of writing about it, the more it became clear that the treaty process was essentially memorializing things countries decided they can do based on what's happening at home. Because a lot of people kind of discount the importance of local activity or individual activity. But what countries do or don't do in these treaties really is a reflection of what has been happening on the ground the last several years, or what they feel they can come to Sharm el-Sheikh or the next treaty nexus with. It's a package of opportunities that have already been created. And Kate, I want to get back to you on that point, but also, I mean, Kate Raworth, because I know you're working with some cities, and I want to bring in David. But anyway, Katie, so what do you think about?
Well, I was just going to say, and that's another thing in that same book is that always spoke to me was the need to move from cosmopolitanism to small, multiple small communities, and I mean that speaks to the systems approach that EE is based on, right? That we need to look at the pieces of the system to understand the whole system rather than trying to change the whole system from just looking as a whole. We can make changes within that will have cascading impacts. And when you try to make that change at the macro level, it's going to be a lot more difficult because there's all these little pieces moving within it. And I think there's still lots of people doing work on national policy, and I think that's important. But I think we're starting to see the power of influencing the system at these more integrated levels. Yeah.
So, David, I had not met you before, so just tell us a little bit about who you are and what drives you forward, and when you reflect backward, how did you come to be a Dalyite, one of the Daly bunch, as I was saying earlier?
Well, have known Herman Daly for many years. I guess we first met in 1985. I went to Louisiana State University specifically to study with him in graduate school. And I think one of his great qualities was I called him up. I had graduated with geology and biology, had one class in economics, and I worked at a mine, and I decided economics is kind of messing things up, whether it's climate, etc. And I read his work and I went, I think I want to go to graduate school there. So I called him up and I told him I only had one class in the economics. And first of all, he answered the phone. Herman, always willing to talk to people. And I think that is an important lesson for us, to talk to young people, new people coming in. And the second thing he said was, that's great. You haven't been brainwashed yet. Come on over for graduate school. And so I went to LSU. My career has been really on applying ecological economics. I did also work on the World Bank while Herman was there, and then other multilateral development banks, the Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, private banks, changing lending policies to bring the environment, climate, and other things in. And of course, Herman was critical at the World Bank for some significant transformation there. And I'd say his work helped weed out maybe the 3 to 5% worst projects and start bringing in major change in policy. So during his time with Robert Goodland, that we all know, the energy policy was changed, the environmental assessment policy. Most importantly, perhaps the information policy. At the World Bank, there were only 8 days notice before a board vote to communities that were impacted. That was extended to 2 years. So communities in Indonesia and elsewhere could really have an impact. So he was transformative in many ways there. For myself and my career, I have founded an organization called Earth Economics, looking at applying ecological economics. So we've worked in many fora, changing federal benefit cost analysis to include natural systems and such. The Army Corps and other agencies are required by law yet to use benefit cost analysis. We haven't changed that yet, but at least we could make major changes to that, which happened in 2016. FEMA also made major changes, which kind of shifts FEMA. We do have a climate agency in the United States. It's the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And so if they can spend billions of dollars building the same thing in the same place where it's destroyed again, or they can shift their landing. And they adopted a perspective with what I feel is ecological economics into policy. We worked, a number of other people worked very hard on that, changing their policy for fire, flood, hurricane, drought, and slide damages. So now they're willing to invest actually in restoration. We know that wetlands in the coastal areas buffer hurricanes. Anyway, moving levees aside, very pragmatic projects I've worked on. Stormwater projects for cities and counties, a lot of local things, maybe 25 or 30 tribes I've worked with on economics in their areas. And I find that tribal vision and ecological economics fit very closely. And it's important to get those areas together. I just returned yesterday from Louisiana, and one of Herman's great legacies is that in Louisiana, ecological economics persists with a large number of people. And even though it seems to be a very conservative state, right now I'm an expert witness on some very large lawsuits against the oil and gas industry. And we just produced a book on the energy production in the Mississippi and the impacts on coastal areas. And the state adopted a very large plan for coastal restoration. And what's fascinating to me is even very conservative parishes are suing the oil and gas industry for damages of land loss and contamination. And that's on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars. So there's really some kind of big transformation taking place in Louisiana. And I guess finally I'll wrap up there. Herman worked with John Day, Bob Costanza was there, a number of other people. Ecological economics was actually founded, the International Society in Louisiana. And it was kind of a triumph in the last couple of years. Herman and those had promoted, we need to liberate the Mississippi River. All the sediment going off the coast. How do you do that? You need to chop some holes in the levee and let that sediment back onto the delta, and you can rebuild quite a lot of area, even with sea level rise and climate change. And just returning, as I say, last night from that area, well, we worked on a $2.2 billion, 2 huge diversions to divert much of that sediment out. That project was approved by the state based on the economics that we provided, looking at fisheries, storm protection, other benefits. So you can have very large infrastructure projects approved if you get in there and apply ecological economics straight out. Finally, I'd like to say deltas are so dynamic. Hurricane Laurie, we just took cores looking at contamination and other things, but what was astounding, there was 7 inches of material that Hurricane Laura threw up on the coast in Cameron Parish across maybe 150 square miles. And John Day, one of the premier wetlands ecologists, says, yeah, this is why the Mississippi Delta areas are actually more sustainable than what people have predicted.
Right.
This was dragged out of the Gulf, thrown up on land, and there it was in a core.
And it didn't have to be put there by the Army Corps of Engineers pumping.
No, that's correct.
Pumping sediment onto
That's
a beach.
correct. So I think there's natural systems are so dynamic. There's a lot of biocapacity that can be brought up. And many of these systems, like the Mississippi Delta, are so degraded. Herman Daly's that there is yet a lot of room, even with sea level rise and climate change, for biocapacity improvement and building better natural systems and economies. So I think Herman has left a tremendous legacy yet, even in Louisiana, let alone all the international and other work he did. Well, thank you for letting me speak. I really enjoyed this meeting.
I think you're showing how this can start to be actualized. The idea of green infrastructure. One of the issues I've run into as a journalist over and over and over again for decades has been the sort of basic economics, saying that $1 spent today ahead of a disaster is worth 10 that you have to spend after the disaster. And certainly traditional economic thinking and models and policy have failed to actually do that. So anything that can tip that forward sounds valuable. Katie had to leave. I saw her child in the picture there. It was wonderful to have her on. But back to Kate, you've been patiently thinking and through here. There was this comment by Nina Smolyar, who posts a relevant resource to what David was just talking about in Louisiana, followtheoil.org. So I'll follow that link later. But maybe, Kate, you could describe a little bit about the concrete, where is this starting to move forward, and what can we learn to spread success stories or those practices?
Yes, and I'm glad to say it doesn't involve concrete. It involves grass and green. So let me just go back to where I began. The squares and the circles, right? This circle that Herman gave to us, it, of course, is the outside circle of planetary boundaries. 2009, Earth system scientist Bob Costanza, I know, being the ecological economist in the room who got the scientists quantifying this. And it's the outside, it's the very outside of this donut. And say, how do we live within that circle that Herman drew for us so many years ago? How do we create economies that thrive within the boundaries that we so far understand? And we're still in early days. We're still just beginning to understand these life supporting systems of the planet and how they interact. So the donut, I first drew it a decade ago. in 2012, and I published a book on it in 2017. And then people started coming and said, yes, nice ideas on the page, but we actually want to do this. I'm a town councillor. I'm a community organizer. I'm taking this to my community. So Andy, can I quickly share my screen? Is it going to let me share my screen?
Yes, it's a two-step process. If you share, then I'll share it.
Here we go. Share screen. Let's see. This works. Are you now seeing my screen?
There we go.
See one slide. Okay, so I'm just going to give you 3 examples, and this I'm bringing these today in celebration of Herman's impact, because every big circle you see in these 3 slides, that's Herman's circle. It wouldn't be there if he hadn't drawn it. So Barcelona is one of the many cities, including Amsterdam and Glasgow and Nanaimo and Dunedin and Ipoh in Malaysia and Copenhagen, that are saying, right, we as a city council are going to use this as a concept. We don't want to be a city that says, we think the shape of success is grow, grow, grow. We believe our success is meeting the needs of all people within the means of the planet. What does it mean to do that here in this city? So we at Donut Economics Action Lab have created a tool. We call it Unrolling the Donut, and cities have started to use it. So here's some photos from Barcelona. That, as you can see on the one side, they're doing it through a really rigorous data analysis. So they're showing, global and local ecological and social overshoots and shortfalls. And they're doing it in a really community engaged way and bringing people in. So because this is about going back to what Katie was saying, how do you really bring this and bring community into it and do economics in a way that everyone understands? And I think there's one thing about ecological economics. Take away the fear of economics that many people have. If you introduce these ideas to most people that go, oh, now this is economics that makes sense to me. I always thought I just didn't get economics, but this economics makes sense to me. So people get this. So there's Barcelona. Let me jump to Leeds in the UK, where a big project working together with the city council have said, we want to create the Leeds donut. And they have, like Barcelona, created that data and they've re-rolled it. And you can see that image and all of that red overshoot. That is to be eliminated. That's overshooting their pressure on the planet. They need to come back within while eliminating human shortfall at the same time. So as you can see in the photo, we put ropes on the floor. We make this fun. We make it irresistible, and we make it utterly make sense so that people step into, what would it mean to step into an economy that actually thrives within the limits of the planet? Again, that's thanks to Herman. The last one I'm going to share, it really brings it to community, and it's a project that's just an hour away from me in Birmingham in the UK. Incredible organization called Civic Square in the neighborhood of Ladywood. Just bringing these ideas. They said, the donut, it makes sense for us, and we're going to bring it right to community. So that photo smack center, they painted the giant picture of the donut on the floor of the warehouse that they're converting into a new community center. So you've got people walking in and they're standing around the planetary boundaries, which are Herman's circle. So this is a way that everyday people in community are first encountering economics that makes sense, economics that actually enables us to start to belong. And they've created in Birmingham the world's first neighborhood scale donut. In fact, it was launched just last week. Many of these photos are just from last week. And they're doing a street level retrofit. So the picture on the right, you can see this. They keep showing up in this one street, which is called Link Road. Beautiful, beautiful coincidence of name. Can this road link us from the past, from these, these houses that are just wasting heat? Can it link us to the future? All of these ideas grounded in recognizing that we must learn to thrive within the limits of the planet. So all of this is thanks to Herman's work. I wish he were here. I mean, don't we wish he were here? I wish I could show him this and he would celebrate the impact that it's having.
Hear, hear. Well, again, the more we can figure out ways to spread the discussion, the better. One of the challenges I still see here, and I try to figure this out in other arenas too, is for templates like the ones you're describing, what can I or Columbia, the Columbia program I am at, or other communicative entities do to facilitate building community understanding that can happen anywhere? You know, is there a template? I'm sure on your website there's sort of a curriculum or a sort of a how-to. You
There
can do this
absolutely
too.
is. toolkit. So we're funded by foundations. So we see ourselves as creating 21st century commons. Now bringing in another of our grades, Ellen Ostrom. How do we create the commons?
Yeah,
we put
for sure.
tools in the commons, and we simply ask for the reciprocity. We say, please share back what you did. Because, you know, I can sit here and talk about ideas, but when I show you those photos from Birmingham and Barcelona and Leeds, a whole other thing happens, and people are like, wait, what? I could do that where I am. So yes, these tools are on our website. I'll share the link just during this conversation, and it's picking up and it's taking off everywhere. And it's the thing I want to say most is, one, it's when people of a place say, now this looks useful to us. No one's pushing it. There's loads of ideas in the world, so just pull on the ideas that make sense to you. But also, it's entirely interpreted by the people of that place. So it's not one of these sort of top-down solutions. It's very much a portrait that's created by people in a place, in the local ecological context, in the local social context, while recognizing that everywhere is connected to the whole world. So we need to understand our footprint on the whole planet and our relationship to people worldwide through supply chains.
So I'd like to ask the others in academia here now, back to Josh and Jon Erickson at University of Vermont, particularly because you're still in classrooms. What can be done in academia? You know, I've been at Columbia now for 3 years, and part of my job there has been to build an internal network that crosses all these disciplinary boundaries. But academia is full of impediments, including, I ran a conversation a year and a half ago when 8 postdocs wrote a manifesto that ran in Nature Sustainability that was basically a plea to academia to offer young scholars, particularly, what they would really need to do the multidisciplinary community-based work that's necessary for sustainability. And it was simple things like time, because it's harder to do multidisciplinary work. You have to talk to an anthropologist. I noticed the Rigo and Katie's network there's an anthropology section and an economics section, et cetera. But building the cross-disciplinary fluency is hard. Building trust, if you're going to do community-based work, research, that requires trust building in the community too. That takes time. And you're not rewarded for that as a young scholar, particularly. You're punished. And one of the scholars, Megan Moorer, came on my show, and she said, what happens sadly is at that stage of your career, you end up doing the low-hanging fruit papers. You do the papers, you want to get published, right? So you do the papers that are in your discipline that don't take as much time, et cetera. So maybe everyone here could just get way into, is there a way to fast track a little bit of change there? Did anything that happened in these last few years related to the pandemic or climate maybe offer a window for sort of a borderless university approach, or just at least changing the incentives? Or are we stuck? The inertial factor in all of these arenas drives me a little bit crazy. Maybe Jon first, and then Josh and anyone else.
Sure. I mean, part of the secret is stepping out of your comfort zone. And, you know, Josh and I have worked really hard to do that at the University of Vermont, to change the incentive structures, to change how we teach. We had the great pleasure actually of working with Herman on a workbook as a companion to his textbook on ecological economics, which built the idea of how to do problem-based learning, how to do service learning, how to learn ecological economics by doing, right? We all know that we learn better by doing. And so I've spent a career blurring the lines between service, research, and teaching, right? That's what we're paid to do. Those are the 3 buckets that academics get paid to do: service, teaching, and research. Unfortunately, the research bucket, especially research that's reported out to your peers on things that they already know, probably gets the most attention. But it doesn't have to be that way. You know, we've got extensive service learning courses at the University of Vermont, where we partner with a community organization from the outset, where we frame a problem that the class works on, where the students roll their sleeves up and engage in the messiness of problem solving. The reason I said you got to step out of your comfort zone, because it's a very dangerous way to teach. You have you lose control. You don't know what the outcome's going to be. You could very well, and I've done this many times myself, get into some very frustrating experiences from the students' perspectives, because they come to us from high school with the attitude of, tell me what I need to know to get an A on the test. Tell me what you already need to know that you already know. Education has been dangerously structured in this very passive way. I was, influenced, as was Herman, about a book called Teaching as a Subversive Activity. It was published back in 68, 69, I think. And that's how I see the privilege of teaching, especially the privilege of being a academic with tenure. There's very few jobs on planet Earth where I can push against the status quo, cause havoc with my bosses, and not get fired for it. Every time I've been sort of called into the principal's office at universities, we call them deans and presidents and vice and provosts. I see that as a badge of honor, and I know Herman did as well.
Well, yeah, that there's the value of tenure for sure. Although tenure can also lock in some pretty antiquated thinking as well.
It can, but I do think learning by doing, service learning, other modes of teaching and learning have made a major impact on academia, and the lag is in kind of reworking the metrics, reworking the incentives, so that those things are rewarded at early stages in your career. Because it is tough to sort of say, go out and take lots of risk before you get tenure. But after you get tenure, oh my Lord, take all the risks you want. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. My wife actually worked for, she just retired from working at a organization called SELF. It's Children's Environmental Literacy Foundation, which was always a bad name because what they did was they worked with teachers to incorporate into their learning, giving teachers ways to integrate sustainability concepts into their existing lesson plans. This is K through 12.
Yeah.
Mostly middle school. And they used some of the donut tools. And that, so I guess what I'm asking is how important is it to take this a step down the chain into the elementary, high school classrooms as well?
We're working in the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources. We work with sustainability schools in the elementary school level at the University of Vermont on incorporating sustainable development goals in our city. We've worked in our college classes with partners in Burlington to initiate what was inspired by Herman's work, the Genuine Progress Indicator. We worked with a class that lobbied the state legislature that got the GPI into law in Vermont, all through student efforts and work. We've worked with Senator Sanders' office to do youth climate summits to bring teams of high school students from across the country and learn how to write climate action plans for their schools. This is all in the context of teaching the principles of ecological economics, an action-oriented curriculum. I think that's the wave of the future.
Well, here's hoping, and again, what I can do in future sessions here is to build forward in these conversations, more specifically to how to integrate this into high school or middle school curricula. Oren Pismoni-Levy, who heads the sustainability education group at Teachers College, which is part of Columbia, is passionate about this too. He works with the New York City school system. It's the biggest one in the country. There are 1,000 sustainability coordinators that the city government mandated schools have. I think it was under Bloomberg. And how do you actualize them? How do you empower them? Most of them just got the title. They didn't get extra money or time. They're just like a teacher who was designated, you're the sustainability coordinator. So there are these pathways forward from this conversation we're having today. I wanted to thank you all so much for being here. Rigo, I thought it would be great to give you one more go at what's something I can help you with, or that you want to spread the gospel of that needs to get out of the network of those who are already here thinking about Herman Daly today.
Well, thank you so much to everyone who is here. I'm honestly every time I hear Kate, John, Josh, Peter's work, I haven't met David before, but I'm sure he's done a lot of great work. But all these people have helped me to think in a very profoundly different way that I would have done in a conventional program. You know, I honestly never would have done a PhD if I couldn't have done it focusing on this. I'm not a PhD type, if you will. I come from a background where I'm a first generation college student. My family, you know, is not something that we do. But the fact that I'm here because of John and Josh, who have kept this going. And, you know, we were brought here under the leadership of the COSOIC to rethink higher education. And I want to get that out there. The leadership of the COSOIC is about rethinking higher education, and some of us focus on rethinking economics within that, right? How do we rethink economics within higher education? Obviously, we can stay within academic circles and talk to each other, regurgitate all this stuff to each other all the time. But what really matters is to get it out there. And I think, you know, I have been allowed to think creatively, to use my creativity to develop ecological economics for all, in which the way you can think about it is a global virtual classroom or textbook outside of university, you know, barriers and limitations, where anyone, it's just like Kate's in similar way, although she's more action, right, oriented. But how do we get the word out to anyone who wants to learn about how the economy works from an ecological perspective, without, you know, all the barriers of information sharing and all of that. And that is the idea of that. And I think, you know, this summer in July, we had one of the first virtual summer courses. A lot of people registered for it. Kate came and spoke with us. Josh, John were there. And we have people who keep asking. They want to come back and learn more about how ecological economics can inform a better future. So I think all that is how we keep Herman Daly's legacy going, you know, rethinking economics, empowering people to have better ways of thinking that are systematic and ethical within the constraints of the biophysical world.
Just no, I know, but that's where we should do another webcast that digs in on some of the projects you're all working on through that network. I'm totally into this idea of spilling the learning outside of classrooms, of inter-university and multidimensional up and down connectivity, so that high school students and college students and professors and practitioners can all find ways to work together. Thanks all today for being here. This is, again, a step on the ladder or on a long journey toward new norms for how the world works and how we can all contribute individually through using our different skills and our perspectives and our communities to make a difference, especially that idea of normalizing, integrating what seems a no-brainer, that social quality and environmental quality, if they're not measured or not integrated into how we plan for the future and invest, and we're going to keep running into these roadblocks. And I use the word measure again there, which is, you know, I think one of Herman's most important points to me. He was not alone in this, by the way. Murray Gell-Mann, a physicist who was a Nobel Prize winner at Santa Fe Institute, he used to talk about something he called claw. Take a crude look at the whole. So he's a Nobel Prize winning physicist, but looking at complex problems, he said you have to step back, take a crude look at the whole. And as a journalist, that's really what I try to do every day. And that means getting away from the idea of measurement. You know, verification to some extent can be a trap, can be a sort of paralytic trap. And I just want to show one last clip from the conversation with Kate 2 years ago, in which Herman articulated this really well. Let me just see if I got this set up right, hopefully. I'm just going to, hold on. There we go.
What is the final product of the economic system in that picture?
Oh, it's the wrong one.
What is the final product of the economic?
Let me go to the right one.
What is the final?
Oh, well, he said it here too. You know, as I said earlier, if you're falling from an airplane, quick, which is more useful, a workable parachute or a precise altimeter. I put these pictures together to convey that. And I want to take this to one last arena. I love the book, The Little Prince. And you're thinking, well, why is this relevant? There's a great line in this book that articulates, I think, the great challenge that we're all talking about here. Let me see if this works. Hopefully it will.
And the roses were humbled.
You're lovely, but you're empty. One couldn't die for you. Of course, an ordinary passerby would think my rose looked just like you. But my rose, all on her own, is more important than all of you together. Since she's the one I've watered, since she's the one I put under glass, since she's the one I sheltered behind the screen, since she's the one for whom I killed the caterpillars.
Whoop, sorry. I had it queued up. I'm going to try one more time because it's really valuable. Or I could just say the line.
And the roses were humbled.
You're lovely, but you're empty. One couldn't die for you. Of course.
Your rose. That makes your rose so important.
It's the time. Get away from them.
It didn't get queued up
I
right.
asked. But he did.
Sorry. I'll just say the line. It's that which is essential is invisible to the eye. And I think in economics and in sustainability questions, you know, one of the best things that could happen at the COP29, COP30 process is to stop talking about 1.5 versus 2. There's some pretty ridiculous formulations for net zero is all about numbers, not about directionality. And we get stuck in these traps and you miss what Herman talked about all the time, which is basic directionality, basic ethical principles, basic ecological principles lead you forward and account for the uncertainty as opposed to thinking you're going to limit the uncertainty going forward. So Kate, David, Rigo, Peter, Josh, John, and Katie, thanks so much for being here today. And let's go forward and try to do more on this important subject going forward.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for having us all here, and thanks for pushing this, getting this information out to the public.
Thanks so
Great.
much.
And this, as soon as we're done, this gets archived and is shareable. You can chop it up into little sound bites and share it on whatever platform you might still be on, even Twitter, perhaps. And again, thanks. This is Andy Revkin from Maine, from Wabanaki territory here, from Columbia University's Climate School, signing off another Sustain Wet broadcast. And have a good weekend, everyone. Go forward and work on it.
Bye, everyone.
Work on it.
Work on it.
Thanks, Andy.
Take care
Bye.
so much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.